Greetings. We're here today with our good friend Jeffrey Munroe. Jeff is the author of a new book titled Telling Stories in the Dark, Finding Healing, Hope in Sharing Our Sadness, Grief, Trauma, and Pain. This book was just released from the new imprint Reform Journal Books. He's also the author of Reading Buechner, exploring the work of a master memoirist, novelist, theologian, and preacher. Jeff is the editor of the Reform Journal and an ordained minister in Reformed Church of America. He previously served as executive vice president of Western Theological Seminary, where he was instrumental in helping me produce the very first Writing for Your Life conference back in 2017. You can learn more about all of Jeff's work at jeffreymunroe, Munroe.com. So Jeff, welcome. It's always so great to speak with you, and I really wish you a big congratulations on this new book.
Thanks, Brian. Happy to be here.
So is there anything else besides what I said that you want people to know about you?
Well, I'm married. My wife would say that's important. 2 kids. And the Reform Journal stuff is reformjournal.com. I'll give that a plug. It's a great site, not because I edit it, but because of the strength of the large number of really great writers that we have, and people will find, I think, interesting and compelling things there too.
Yeah, I subscribe to it too. So there's actually kind of two things that we want to talk about today. First is the book, of course, but then later on we'll talk about finding a calling. Finding your next calling is the name of the platform that I've launched in that regard. But first, let's talk about the books. The book, as I said, Telling Stories in the Dark. I have to say that I just finished reading it, and it's fantastic. I literally couldn't put it down. And I'm not typically reading this type of book, honestly, right? I mean, I read many more books about social justice or marketing or politics or things like that. But this was just wonderful. So, I'd love for you to share with folks how the book came about.
Yeah, well, you had something to do with that. So, I wrote the book Reading Buechner, and Buechner has this idea called the stewardship of pain, which I think is an enormously huge concept. And when I wrote Reading Buechner, I'm not trying to denigrate, because I worked with an editor that was fantastic, but I had written an introduction where I told a little bit of my own story and about my wife's stroke that happened a month before we were married. That was, we're coming up almost now on 40 years ago, but it's still very vivid in my mind, and some events around that, and how that led me into a deep engagement with Buechner and that idea of the stewardship of pain. And my editor at that time said, he kept cutting it, and at least half of what I wrote didn't make it into the book. And so then when the book came out, I had a lot of people that would tell me, all the stuff you wrote about Buechner is great. I'm really interested in him, but I really like that part you wrote about yourself.
Yeah.
You ought to do more of that. And that just kind of struck me as ironic. And so I had that in my mind, and thinking about the idea of the stewardship of pain. And then you said something to me. It was right about the time of the pandemic too, because that was very much on my mind with all the loss that we had experienced in the pandemic. And then I'll tell you one more thing about the writing of it. My first idea was to try to read everything about loss, grief, trauma, pain that I could. And I did that for about 6 months. And after about 6 months of that, I just gave up. I was like, I don't have anything new to say. I can't do this. And a few more months passed, and then just one day, the idea came to me. What if, instead of trying to make myself the expert, I did what I'm good at, which is telling stories? What if I told stories and then interviewed actual experts about those things? So put myself in the role, not of an expert, but in the role of a journalist, really, of a reporter that was asking questions, and then it just went from there. So really, it really took off at that point, and here it is. into the world now. So
Well,
it was
I,
a couple of year process
I
though.
mean, I think that was a brilliant approach because most of the time what people do, what you sought to do at the beginning, kind of study up and say something new and profound, but it's more or less just about them, you know,
Yeah.
and your story is very compelling. And I had heard you tell it in person
Yeah.
also along the way there. So, I was familiar with it from reading Beekner. I was familiar with it by hearing you talk about it. And obviously I was very familiar with Beekner's, Stewardship of Pain essay. And, as you mentioned, found that to be quite a compelling concept, and his articulation of it, and his own discovery of it, even, which was, somewhat happenstance, like so many other things that he's encountered and I've encountered. But so all those things kind of combined together is why I suggested, why don't you think about writing a book about this?
Yeah.
Because I just think that there's so much, unfortunately, so much territory, you know, um,
Yeah.
so many stories, like you're saying. But
And can I just jump in one
yeah,
more
yeah.
thing there? I will say too about myself. I find, and so as I was reading these kind of abstract analyses of pain and lists of, whatever a person thinks, I just can't read that stuff. You know, I had that, I went to seminary. I had that in seminary when we try to read theology and philosophy. And I mean, it just was, I'm worse now than I was then, but even then it was a struggle for me. I am a story person. I just gravitate to stories. I need stories. And so the idea of doing a book of stories really that's really energizing for me because I just don't know that we need more propositional statements of truth as much as we just need to hear each other's stories and live with each other's stories.
Well, I'm in some ways the opposite of you in that. I really don't like, generally speaking, I don't like books with lots of stories on.
Yeah.
You know, I
And also fiction,
Yeah, I
there's
don't like fiction either.
novels. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's like I'm more analytical and, just get to the point, and explain the rational logic and the structure and everything else. But that's more in business,
Mhm.
kinds of thing. But in theology, I mean, look at the Bible. That's
Yeah,
all it is stories, right? I
there
mean,
is. Yeah.
and
And
look at,
Jesus is a master storyteller.
yeah, and look at the lives that we lead.
Yeah.
And you know, I've gained so much more personally from the interactions with great people than I have is even reading all the tons of books that I've read. So, go figure. Anyway, I love that structure of the book, the way that you did it that way. And one of the things that struck me about it is that you knew all these people so well, both the folks that are the focus of the story, as well as the folks who you brought in to reflect on them. So, I mean, to me, that's a testament to your network, and all the great relationships that you've built over the year. But what is your reaction to that?
Well, people have said to me, boy, you know a lot of people that have had significant things happen to them. And my response to that is, so do you. You can't be human without,
Yeah,
everybody faces loss. Everybody faces sorrow, sadness, grief, trauma. All those things are prevalent. Um, I knew 7 people that died during the first year of the pandemic.
hmm.
So if I knew 7 people, multiply that by the hundreds of thousands of people that died.
Yeah,
Everybody's connected here somehow. And so, yeah, I just think that loss is around us. Now, we live in a world, in a culture that, and even in a church culture that wants to be upbeat and positive, and I do too. We made the subtitle "Finding Healing and Hope," rather than say, "Here's some depressing things." And it is a book about resilience and hope in many ways.
Yes.
But it's also about, let's be honest, let's tell the truth about the realities that we live with. The other thing I would say is also in terms of our culture, grief. We give people permission to grieve. We give them permission to grieve for about 12 months. And then
If that long.
after 12 months, it's time to get on with your life. It's time to get up and get over that.
Mm-hmm.
And that is not how grief works. You don't get over it. You don't like one of the people I interviewed in the book, it's fairly well known, Nicholas Waltersdorf, said, am I supposed to forget that my son existed? The other day I was in a conversation with some folks using the book, and I just said, do people have times in their life that they can remember where they just said, why, God, why is this happening to me? And one of the guys in the room is a guy that's in his 90s. And he told a story about wanting to have a brother as when he was a kid. And then finally, his family, they did have a brother. And while the brother was a baby, the baby died. And he said, I can still remember riding to church. He said, I can tell you the exact place where this was. It's only a few miles from where we are. Sitting in the car, crying and saying, why? And I mean, he was emotional as he's telling us this story. And I asked him, how long ago? I mean, we sat in silence for a minute with that. But then I asked him, how long ago did that happen? And he thought for a minute, did some math in his head, and said 88 years.
Oh, jeez. Wow.
88 years. And
wow.
The wound doesn't close.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the same, but it doesn't close. And he said, I tried to talk about this 30 years ago in this room with another group, and I couldn't even do it.
Wow.
So,
wow.
Yeah, these are real parts of life.
Yeah. Yeah. Goodness sakes. So, one of the things that you say in the book is that, obviously you had these conversations, a lot of conversations around very traumatic things. But you've said that you don't get depressed, but instead, and I quote here, feel hopeful because I sense the healing is happening in the act of sharing the story, which I totally believe and can see that. But tell us more about your thoughts on that.
Well, this goes back to Buechner's stewardship of pain idea. And, he turns the parable of the talents from Matthew 25 on its head and says, what if pain is what we're given? And the servant in the parable that buries his talent, buries his pain, buries it inside of himself, is the one that's thrown into the outer darkness. And you and I have both heard 1,000 sermons about that passage of scripture saying it's about managing our money and giving more money to the church. And Buechner says, what if it's about pain, which is something we never would have imagined, but he does it so beautifully. And to bury our pain, to pretend it doesn't exist, that anything that you bury while it's still alive is going to come up, and it's going to come out, and it's going to come out in ways that aren't helpful. And so the first step in being a steward of your pain is simply in telling the story. I just read, this is my reading material these days, I just read in the AARP magazine, Brian, which you also, I'm sure.
No, I'm not old enough.
That'll get into the find your next colleague, right? We're all that, but I just read the story of this guy named Clint Hill, who was a Secret Service agent who jumped on the back of John F. Kennedy's limousine in 1963 after the shots went out. He tried to kill himself a month after that happened.
Oh my!
Because he was so distraught, and eventually was retired, quote unquote, by the Secret Service while he was still a young man because he couldn't function and was drinking heavily. And he said, there was nobody said, how are you doing? Nobody talked about PTSD. There was just no avenue for him. And it wasn't until the 1990s, I think, maybe 30 years or so after the event, that it was actually with a reporter that asked him to tell his story. It was the first time he told the story. And in telling the story, he said this great release of being able to let go of it, in a sense, by telling it. So that's the first step, I think, that is really, really significant in being able just to share and to find a place to share. Another Buechner-ism I'll use is that Buechner, you remember that Buechner said the church ought to be a lot more like Alcoholics Anonymous.
Very profound statement. Another very profound statement.
Meaning that we need to create space to listen to each other and to hear each other and to share, be able to share at deep levels with each other.
And, you and I, and even more Buechner, grew up in a generation where, none of us was
those things. Yeah.
You had to be rock solid and hard and, ward off all the enemies and demons or whatever, that come your way. And
sweep it under the rug.
Yeah. Yeah.
Stiff upper lip.
Yeah, exactly. So, I know there are some great stories in this book. And I always, hesitate to ask anybody to pick one, but is there any particular one that you'd like to talk about here?
We could talk about any of them. Let's talk about the dementia story for a minute, because that's really personal.
Yeah.
Me. I tell the story of my mother dying from Alzheimer's, and then I process that with a woman who's a dynamo, Suzanne McDonald, who teaches at Western Theological Seminary, teaches systematic theology, but also is an expert in dementia. Has done a lot of work, and she really helped me understand Alzheimer's. So we had a lot of, with my mother, it was, the first few years were actually not awful. She didn't wander the way that some people do, and she was never combative. Her personality didn't change the way some people's do. But the last few months was horrible. And it's just a horrible way for people to die. And so Suzanne really helped me understand quite a bit about dementia and about Alzheimer's, which is, dementia is an umbrella term, and there's lots of different kinds of dementia. Alzheimer's is probably the most prevalent. And that's one of those universal things that, everybody knows somebody, right? If it's not in your family, it's in your friend's family. As we face the end of life, and it's not a normal part of aging, even though we kind of tend to think it is. It shouldn't be that way, but it is. Yeah.
No, I'm sorry you had to go through that. As you said, so many of us have experienced that, with folks in various ways, and I'm included in that as well.
Yeah.
So let's shift gears a little bit now and talk about finding your next calling.
Okay.
So you, from a career perspective, had long and successful stints at Young Life and Western Theological Seminary, and then you decided to go off on your own, basically, and launch new things, which I love, by the way. So have you reflected much on the process that you used particularly when you were at that point where, you had left the kind of like, corporate organizational career life behind and were embarking out on your own?
Yeah. So, I read something else the other day, and this could well have been an AARP again. that said, I don't know if it was there or someplace else, but that said, most of us think we're going to retire on our own terms at age 60, and the average retirement age is 62, and people don't get to decide. Yeah, and
Yeah, I believe
when I,
that.
when I worked in the seminary, the conversation I would often have with people is, did you drive the bus or did you get hit by the bus?
Ah, wow.
You know, so an earlier point in my life, you mentioned I worked for Young Life for 29 years. I wound up actually I was in my early 50s. I was living in Europe. I was the director of Young Life in Western Europe. And I was both personally unhappy and just with the situation there, and I was professionally unhappy. And I left that position not knowing what was next.
Mm.
And then moved back to the United States, thought I had a job lined up. That didn't work out. And so I had a little unplanned sabbatical
Mm.
at midlife and um, came in second place at least two times that are very vivid in my memory, but I think there may have been more for positions before I started working at Western Seminary. And I was supporting myself doing freelance stuff, a lot of fundraising because I'd had background in fundraising and a lot of writing things, and got the job at the seminary, and that was fundraising. And
Mm.
so I could do that, but I knew it wasn't ultimately what I wanted to do.
Mm.
Um, so I started in fundraising, and then I moved into operations and executive VP, working really closely with Tim Brown, who was the
Mhm.
president at that time. He and I got along great. So part of my job was having conversations with Tim about his retirement. Um, and he was in his late 60s and had some health issues going on. And so we talked all that through. And I knew in a sense that I was also ending my own career at the seminary. If I'd have kept him going for another few years, um, then my job would have kept going. But
Mhm.
bringing in a new president, um, after a year, he and I decided that, we were going to go in a different way, a different route. And so that was in some ways, obviously not what I wanted, because I thought, like everybody else, I thought I would do this job, well into my 60s. And I was only, I think, 61 when that happened. But at the same time, it was a liberating thing because the new president wanted to go in his own direction. And I wasn't part of that. And that was fine with me. And the pandemic had started, and there were a number of other issues that they were facing. And I was like, this just feels liberating to be free from those things. So something really significant that I would say that happened then was I went to my financial advisors and sat and talked with them about whether or not I needed to have a full-time job. And they said, no, that you've actually got enough money saved. And we talked about, when do we start Social Security? I mean, all these kind of,
Sure. Been
things.
there.
Yes. Um, but they told me I had the freedom to do what I wanted to do. And that was also hugely liberating. And so then if it's up to me to say, what do I want to do? Well, I've known that my whole life. It's just I never thought I could make a living doing it. And that was, I want to write. I'm a writer at heart, and I probably could have made a living doing it, but I never did up until this point. And so then the Reform Journal was something I'd been involved with for years, and that was just kind of lying there, waiting for new energy and new direction. And so I was able to pour myself into that. And I'd had Reading Buechner came out while I worked at the seminary, and then the idea for a second book came. So those things that's what I always knew that I wanted to do. And now I had the freedom to pursue it without caring about whether I was going to make enough money and be able to support and have health insurance and things like that. Um, I want to say live in the style I was accustomed to. There's an old joke about that. Do you have time for a joke? Can I tell
Sure,
you?
sure.
Yeah, about the guy that goes to his he asks his future father-in-law if he can ask the daughter to get married, and the future father-in-law says, well, will you be able to provide for her in the style she's accustomed to? The guy says, I don't see why not. We're going to move in with you.
Oh, that's good. That's good.
Anyway, I don't know if what I said made any sense, but
Well,
that's my
so I mean,
experience.
basically for you then, I mean, discernment wasn't a big deal. You already
I
knew
knew it.
what
Yeah,
you
I'd known
wanted
it
to
for
do.
years.
It was
Yeah,
more of a question of, okay, what's the, for lack of a better term, business structure
yeah,
you want to choose to support that?
right. And
I mean,
sometimes,
obviously one structure is just go off on your own and write books,
yeah,
right? You're doing some of that, but you also, latched on to the Reformed Journal, and now the Reformed Journal books is
yeah,
launching out of that too. So
right.
talk about a little bit about your quest for finding the right structure.
Yeah. Well, I think that all of us, um, I I just think it's rare that you get paid to do what you really want to do. I said right. I guess I could have also said be the play-by-play voice of the Detroit Tigers.
Oh, there you go.
That
There you
one never
go.
happened for me. Although my wife always says I'll say something and then the announcer will say it a second later and she goes, "Boy, you missed your calling. You should have been that guy." Um, but I think few of us get that gift in life that we can do the thing that we just know that we're supposed to do. Sometimes we have to do something that's not that 80% of it lines up or 60 or 70% of it lines up. I think if only 20% of it lines up, we can't keep doing it.
Yeah.
But 80% of it lines up. And then 20% of it is stuff we don't really enjoy doing, but we know we can do them. But we have to do those because the world's not built around me, right? The world just doesn't work that way. So then finding the freedom, I go back to having the financial resources in place to be able to do that. And that was because I'd spent a lifetime putting money into, when they said, here's the limit that you can put in, I would always do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Put the money into the retirement accounts because people are living longer than ever, and you want to be equipped for that. And
Yeah.
so do
Yeah.
that when you're in your 30s. It's the most boring thing in the world to think about when you're in your 30s and your 20s but do it. And you'll come to a point in your life where you look back and you go, I'm really glad I did that. So I don't know if that answers your question on structure, but that's a little bit of what I'm thinking of.
Yeah. No, I mean, absolutely, absolutely true. But again, you kind of decided to take over or take on Reform Journal, which had to be not an easy decision, right? I mean, for various reasons.
Well, it
What,
was
how did you go
Brian.
about that?
Brian, you're looking at the editor of the 1976 Flint Southwestern High School Hoofbeat. You know, so I was a journalism major at Michigan State. So before I decided to go into ministry, so those things had always kind of
Wow.
my blood.
Wow.
And then I'd been involved as a board member with the Reform Journal for
Hmm.
a long time, and then and actually the Reform Journal almost died, and I was one of the few people still standing, and so it was, can we resurrect? That's the wrong word.
But figure out a model to keep it.
Resuscitate. Yeah, a
Yeah.
friend of mine always says there's only one resurrection. We can't use that word for anything else. Can we resuscitate? And we had a million page views last year,
Wow.
2023.
Good for
So
you.
yeah, so we've resuscitated, and we're still very much growing. And that has also been, I will say this too, that I edit things, I do the writings, I write things, but it's also, the skills that I've learned in working in Young Life and working in the seminary, I've also had to bring to bear here. So we've been around since 1951, but the Reformed Journal was never a 501c3
Hmm.
organization.
Hmm.
So I've led us through that process, got an attorney to do that, created a board of trustees, started raising money, all those kinds of things that are the business side of things that are never seen, but absolutely necessary if you're going to have a venture that's successful. So I've had to do those kinds of things also.
Wow. So, since you've been off on your own now, what recommendations do you have for other people who are considering, what's next?
Yeah. So this is what I would say about calling, Brian, is I don't think calling is a mystery. I don't think it's that we go through life and maybe I'm way off on this. I don't think that we go through life saying, "Oh, I should have been a policeman, but I never thought of it." Right? I think we know. And if I could quote John Calvin here, if that's allowed, um, Calvin talked about inner and outer calling. And I think the inner sense is that tug at our heartstrings, that we know this is what I'm supposed to, this is what I'm good at. This is what I'm supposed to do. But then he had this phrase that he used, the outer calling. And so outer has to do with who around you agrees with this. When you say my calling is I'm going to be a folk musician, and you have no musical talent whatsoever, people around you will tell you, maybe not, right? Maybe you need to think that through. So what kind of affirmation do those who know you well give
Mhm.
you about that? And so with the Reformed Journal, jumping into that, it was also that the other people involved were all like, yes, we want you to do this. I mean, it was a friend, another editor, my partner on this, who said, hey, you've got some more time now. You've got a window. You've got to be the guy that does this. And so that is the affirmation as well. So I think there's got to be those two things lining up. There's got to be alignment, right? If everybody around you is saying to you, don't do this, um, either you're a prophet and, and the chances of you being that are, maybe you are, but those are slim. Chances are you've got to listen to those around you as well as follow what's in your heart. But I don't think calling is necessarily supposed to be a mystery. Um, well, I'll tell you one other thing that I thought about when I left Young Life, and again, this is 2010, after 29 years, they paid for me to do some career testing stuff
Hmm.
with the guy. And that was great. And one of the things the guy said, he looked at my stuff and he said, you are not political. And I said, okay, I don't know what that means. I vote, I don't know. What do you mean by that? And he said, you can't work in an environment where there's going to be strong disagreements, differences of opinion. You need to have everybody on the same page
Hmm.
around you. And I said, okay, so what's that mean? He goes, well, it means there are two places you can't work. And I said, all right. He said, you should not be a politician. You should not run for office. You don't have the skin to do that. And I said, that's fine. I had no idea, no aspiration to ever do that. Then the second thing he said is, you should never work in a church.
Whoa. Wow. I thought you were going to say Wall Street, but
Yeah, no, he said, you should never work in a church. And I've worked adjacent to the church, but I've
uh,
ordained, but I've not led a congregation.
uh-huh.
And he said, you couldn't handle having 300 bosses. Um, and that was a really helpful. So that was a really helpful thing for me.
Interesting.
Yeah. So uh, I've not followed that path. I could have because I had the credentialing for it, but I knew in my heart and I knew in my brain also from hearing him talk about that kind of thing would tear me up and I wouldn't last doing it. And
Well,
then, also I would say one more thing. At that time, I mentioned that I had some close calls 2 or 3 times where I came in second
mhm.
for jobs. I look back on those as divine guidance too. That the things that didn't happen, I'm really happy that they didn't happen. Um, in retrospect, at the time, of course, disappointed, but in retrospect, looking back at them, no, those would not. One of them would have involved moving across the country. Um, yeah, they just wouldn't have been the things that I should have done.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, I want to go back to a couple of things you touched on. One is kind of the alignment and resonance, the internal, external thing. I so agree with that. When I've had situations where, I'm looking to figure out what I want to do next, it's been incredibly valuable to me to have conversations with people, just to brainstorm or talk about different pros and cons of different ideas, things like that. But the mystery part is much different for me than it was for you. My earlier career, was in high tech. And, during those decades, literally decades, if you would have said something to me about writing for your life or, working with authors or compassionate Christianity or how to heal or advise or all this other stuff that I've done, I would have looked at you like you were crazy.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That was never on my radar screen, like your journalism, thread was for you. That was a complete surprise, out of the blue kind of a situation that, I ended up in.
But what you've done, Brian, is you brought entrepreneurial gifts and skill to a world that was sadly lacking in it. And so you brought business sense to people that needed somebody to whack them across the head with some business sense.
Well, I won't argue with that. I mean, there's very few people that I know of that made that kind of a transition from technology and business to, this world.
Yeah.
And I'm very grateful, very, very grateful for having done that. But it certainly was not obvious to me a priori.
Yeah. Well, most authors just almost have I'm struggling for the right word, but they're revulsion. That's the word.
Yeah.
Revulsion about selling a book. You're the chief marketing officer of your book. You got to be out there, and that's a lot of us are introverted. A lot of authors are introverted. We're perfectly happy sitting by ourselves in our basement or in our writing room or wherever, just working on something. We love that, but the idea of then you got to get out there and you got to sell it. I remember somebody, a very, very successful, well, maybe not successful in terms of sales, but prolific, I should say, author who said to me about a different, she was doing a book with a different publisher than her traditional publisher. She said, whatever you do, don't publish with them. And I said, well, why? And she goes, oh, the things they expect you to do. She started listing them, and they're all the things you tell people to do. These were not crazy ideas, but she just didn't want to do any of them.
There are a lot of folks like that.
Yeah, in the Reformed world, there's a line in the Belgic Confession about putting yourself forward. And so we lean into that, we're not supposed to put ourselves forward, right? And so that's a hard thing for authors.
But the people miss the distinction of putting yourself forward versus helping other people.
Yeah, right.
So it goes back to why are you doing this in the first place, right?
Right.
And if your motivation is to be famous or whatever, sell books or yada, yada, yada. That's one thing.
Yeah.
But most people that I've dealt with, the real motivation is I've experienced something or I've learned something that I want to help other people see and, benefit from my mistakes if or whatever in some cases, and so that's a completely different motivation than self-promotion. That's trying to serve people.
Right. And if your motivation is to be famous, don't be a writer.
Yeah, I mean,
because
what minute percentage comes out that way?
Well, I think the best-selling writer in America right now is James Patterson. And I'm serious.
Yeah.
I think he is. And I think James Patterson basically could walk down the street, walk down downtown in most any city in the world and not be recognized.
Yeah.
It's just that doesn't necessarily follow. Fame doesn't follow for writers. Go into television. Go into be Taylor Swift. That's how you.
There you go.
Yeah.
All right. So let's circle back for a minute to your book. How has the book launch gone? And how do you see, the Reform Journal books imprint going forward?
Yeah. So I'll just say this about the launch. This book was written with an intention. Sure, people can read it by themselves, but my great hope for it is that it begins conversations and that it would be used in groups. And so I'm seeing that start to happen, and have had different conversations with people, even a conversation possibly about a prison education program using that. Those kinds of things are very encouraging to me. So
yes,
the launch has been great. In terms of Reform Journal books, that's an imprint that we started with Front Edge Publishing, and I'm optimistic. I got a board meeting coming up in a couple of weeks where we're going to talk about this, but I think that this was our first, this is our test in a sense, but I think that we're going to continue to do this. We have great writers, and I want to be a place for our writers that their ideas could get developed into book length, and continue to highlight these kinds of voices that we have that I think need to have their work out there. So, yeah.
Well, keep us posted. We're always looking for the kinds of books that you're interested in too. So
definitely will.
Good. Well, Jeff, many congratulations on this new book. I know, it was a labor of love and it was quite a labor, quite an amount of work for you to do, but I just thought it was really compelling, and I'm sure that it'll do well. So best wishes on that and the Reform Journal books. And as I said before, you can learn more about Jeff at jeffreymunroe.com. Thanks so much, Jeff.
Thanks, Brian. Great talking to you.